The little girl was halfway onto the bus when she suddenly turned around. She stepped back onto the sidewalk, raised her small hand to her forehead, and gave the elderly man in the faded uniform the most serious salute she could manage. For several seconds, he couldn't move. If quiet moments of kindness still mean something to you, stay with me, because sometimes the smallest gesture reaches a place nobody else can see. His name was Walter Bennett, and he was 74 years old. Every morning at exactly 7:20, Walter left his small brick house at the end of Maple Street. He walked 3 blocks, past the bakery, crossed at the pharmacy, then sat on the same wooden bench beside the number 7 bus stop. And almost every morning, Walter wore a carefully pressed dark blue veteran's uniform jacket. The fabric was old. The cuffs had begun to soften. The metal buttons were no longer as bright as they had once been. But the jacket was always clean, always straight, always buttoned. People in the neighborhood had noticed. Some assumed Walter was attending ceremonies. Others thought he simply enjoyed the attention. A few teenagers had even whispered jokes when they saw him, but Walter never answered them. What nobody knew was that Walter hadn't simply decided to dress formally every day. For nearly 10 years, he had made wearing that jacket part of his daily routine. Whenever he stepped outside his home, the uniform went with him. It had started after his wife, Helen, died. Helen had been the person who knew Walter before the medals, before the gray hair, before the slow walk and careful routines. They had spent more than 40 years together. After losing her, Walter's world became painfully quiet. Friends moved away, neighbors changed, pawn calls became less frequent, days began to blend together. And the old uniform became something familiar, something connected to a time when Walter knew exactly where he belonged. Every morning, he polished his shoes, straightened the jacket, checked the small row of medals, then looked at himself in the hallway mirror. It gave the day structure, but over the years, something had changed. Walter was no longer wearing the uniform because it made him proud. He was wearing it because he didn't know who he was without it. On the other side of town lived an 8-year-old girl named Sophie Carter. Sophie took the number 7 bus 3 mornings each week, with her grandmother. She was small for her age, endlessly curious, and usually carried a purple backpack that seemed almost as large as she was. Her grandmother had taught her a simple rule: if someone looks lonely, you don't have to fix their life. You can simply let them know you've seen them. Sophie had noticed Walter weeks earlier. The old man was always there. Same bench, same uniform, same straight posture. People walked around him, some nodded, most didn't. Sophie kept looking at the medals on his jacket. One morning, she finally asked her grandmother, was he a soldier? Her grandmother glanced toward Walter. I imagine he served a long time ago. Should I say thank you? You can, if you'd like. Sophie thought about that, but the bus arrived before she could do anything. The next morning, Walter was there again. And again, Sophie watched him. This time she noticed something different. He didn't look proud, he looked tired. 3 days later, the morning was cold and cloudy. Walter sat on the bench with both hands resting on his cane. Sophie and her grandmother waited several feet away. When the bus appeared at the corner, Sophie took her grandmother's hand, then she stopped. Grandma, yes? I forgot something. Before her grandmother could ask what, Sophie turned around. She walked directly toward Walter. Walter looked up, the girl stood straight. Her little purple backpack hung crookedly from one shoulder. Then, with complete seriousness, Sophie lifted her right hand to her forehead. She saluted him. Walter stared at her. No one had saluted him in years. Not here, not at this bus stop, not while strangers hurried past him as if he were another piece of street furniture. Sophie lowered her hand.
Thank you,
she said. Walter swallowed. For what? She looked confused by the question. For what you did. Walter glanced down at his jacket, then back at Sophie. You don't even know what I did. Sophie shrugged. My grandma said you probably helped people when you wore that. Walter gave a tiny smile. That was a very long time ago. Sophie studied him for another second, then she asked, do you still have to wear it? Walter's smile disappeared. Sophie immediately worried she had said something wrong. But Walter wasn't angry. Nobody had ever asked him that. People asked about his medals, people asked where he served, people occasionally thanked him, but nobody had ever asked why the uniform was still there. Walter looked down at his sleeves. No, he said quietly. Sophie nodded. Okay, that was all. Her grandmother called her gently, The bus doors were waiting. Sophie hurried away. Before stepping aboard, she turned around one more time and waved. Walter raised his hand. But this time, he didn't salute, he simply waved back. That afternoon, Walter stood in front of his hallway mirror for a long time. The house was silent. He slowly touched one of the medals on his chest. For years, he'd believed taking off the jacket would mean putting away everything that came with it. His service, his friends, his younger self, even Helen, who had once helped him straighten the collar before veterans' dinners. But that little girl hadn't saluted a jacket. She had saluted him. Walter suddenly understood the difference. He unbuttoned the uniform, folded it carefully, and placed it across the foot of his bed. Then he opened his closet. Behind several dark shirts was a soft brown sweater. Helen had bought him years before. He hadn't worn it outside in a very long time. Walter ran his hand over the sleeve. And smiled. The next morning, Sophie stepped onto Maple Street holding her grandmother's hand. She looked toward the bus stop. Walter was there, but something was different. No uniform, no polished military shoes. Walter wore gray trousers, comfortable walking shoes, and the brown sweater. Sophie stared. Walter noticed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie smiled. "I like your sweater." Walter looked down at it. "My wife picked it. She had good taste." Walter laughed. It was a real laugh. The kind that surprised him as much as everyone else. Over the following weeks, small things began to change. Walter still came to the bus stop. But he didn't always sit alone. Sometimes he spoke to Sophie's grandmother. Sometimes he helped another passenger read the tiny print on the timetable. Once, when Sophie complained about a school history project, Walter offered to tell her what daily life had been like when he was young. Not stories about battles. Stories about people. Friendship waiting for letters. Missing home, learning to trust others. The uniform remained carefully stored in Walter's closet. He still wore it on meaningful occasions, but it was no longer armor he needed every morning. One Saturday, Sophie and her grandmother saw Walter outside the neighborhood bakery. He was carrying 2 coffees. Beside him stood another older man from the local community center. Walter lifted 1 cup. "Making a friend?" Sophie's grandmother asked. Walter smiled. "Trying to." A few weeks later, he joined a weekly breakfast group. Then he began volunteering one morning each month at a community library, where he helped organize photographs and local history records. His life didn't suddenly become perfect. Some evenings were still quiet. He still missed Helen. There were mornings when old memories felt heavier than others. But now Walter understood that remembering the past did not require living inside it. And every few mornings, when the number 7 bus approached, Sophie would look at Walter mischievously, then she would raise her hand in another salute. Walter would shake his head. "No uniform today." Sophie would grin. "I'm not saluting the uniform." The first time she said it, Walter had to look away for a moment. Because 8-year-old Sophie had somehow understood something that had taken him 10 years to learn. Sometimes the things we hold on to remind us who we were, but kindness can remind us that we still have someone left to become. If this story touched you, comment, "Kindness lives here," below. And if someone once noticed you during a time when you felt invisible, share that memory too. You never know who might need to read it today.